Ready? Dollywall asked, his tail flickering with eager excitement.
Just about,
Rugg said. She did a brass check on her pistol and checked down to the small of her back. She withdrew a collapsible baton and flicked her wrist, sending the custom-made baton to its 3-foot length. She pressed a red button on the handle. The button let out an angry crackle of electricity that cast a blue glow across her face. Her features, bathed in the blue light of the crackling stun baton, were beatific. She had the look of a warrior monk prepared to die a happy death on a field of battle, like she was born to do. Happy to meet her demise and take her seat at the All-Father's table. I was less enthusiastic, however. "Take it easy there, Mike Pence," I said, reference to the stun baton. She looked over at me, her eyes rolling as far back in her skull as her anatomy would allow.
"Ready, come?"
was all she said, in a tone of voice that left no doubt of who she voted for in 2016. All I could do was laugh, which was a mistake with the busted rib, but was worth it nonetheless. I spared a glance up at the shitbird maintaining his singular air patrol over our position. He was noticeably silent. His beady little shitbird eyes were watching us. I didn't possess the ability to read the expression on his face, on account of the lack of light and him having this stupid-ass bird face. But if I had to guess, and maybe this was wishful thinking on my part, it looked like there was a bit of trepidation plastered across the mug of the old Bertie McBird face up there. I considered the pain in my side. I decided it was going to be a huge obstacle if the fight got face to face. I decided that it might be just worth a little sacrifice to not have to deal with that. I reached down to my duty belt. I withdrew an old battered Kabar fighting knife. It had the old style wood grip, and it looked mostly like an old style Kabar, which is what it was. Mostly. Big difference between this knife and every other knife that rolled off the assembly line along with it were the golden runes inlaid across the knife's black blade. The runes weren't off just one runic alphabet. I recognized the Elvish rune and the Angelic rune. The rest, however, to this day, is still a mystery to me. They glowed softly in the dark. I regarded the blade for a moment, taking into consideration what I was about to do. "Oh, hell with it," I mumbled as I drew a sharp edge of the blade down my forearm, giving myself a 1-inch cut. Blood beaded up the wound and pressed into the tip of the blade, smearing blood along the flat of the blade. I muttered a few words under my breath. A feeling of warmth seemed to radiate from my hand, a feeling of calm. The pain in my chest seemed to die down a little too, to something manageable. I let out a small sigh of relief. Thing was better than Tylenol. I knew it was an illusion though. The rib was still busted and still liable to end up poking a hole in my lung if it got a little too out of pocket, but it wasn't kicking up as much of a caterwaul. Wonder how many days of my life that's going to end up costing me. I remember thinking in reference to using the painkilling effect of the blade. I caught Dollywall looking at the knife with a bit of awe. He knew what it was. I caught his eye and he nodded respectfully. "I come," he said, a bit of reverence in his voice. "I had no idea." "Don't get too wrapped around the axle on it," I said, heading him off at the pass, not wanting to get into a conversation about where I'd been and what I'd done to have this kind of blade in my possession. I just knew some people that needed a hand somewhere back along the line. Nothing special. He stared at me for a good long moment, his muzzle twitching slightly at the thought. His eyes narrowed for a moment before he made a simple, "Of course," and went back to watching outward. I could tell that wasn't enough of an explanation for him, but we had other pressing matters at the moment. He let it go. For now. He knew what the knife meant, what it symbolized. He knew what I'd just done with the ritual. He was probably going to want a full story, but that wasn't a tale I was about to share with just anyone. Anyone alive, at least. Speaking of knives, I remember coming to a realization that I was holding a knife in my offhand and a pistol in my right hand. I had a mental flash of a short man with a bald head sporting a fake Jamaican accent, running down an alleyway screaming like an idiot, before blasting the ceiling of a firing range. I chuckled and muttered, "Eat a dick," to myself. "Sorry?" Dollywall asked, one of his ears perking up in my direction. "Nothing," I said out loud, not feeling like explaining a walking meme from bowels of internet gun culture. The most of the people reading this won't even get it. Let alone a Rakshashan tiger man who didn't even have a MySpace account. I was just thinking of someone. We're about 50 yards from the cars at this point, and it briefly occurred to me that this whole thing could be a bit of a bluff from the shitbirds. We might have been able to just slide into the rides and skedaddle. I mean, that would have made the most fucking sense, from an outsider's perspective. But that might not have been the case. They might also be waiting for us to get into cars and feel safe right before they swarm us. They might also have been just trying to send the sheriff's department a message. While we might not understand said message, we had damn sure better pay attention to it. I know that sounds silly, but you have to understand. We aren't normal deputies, and our situation is anything but normal. Bull's Heart and her sister townships and colonies are tolerated by the government, not wanted. Big difference. If the Department of Defense or Homeland Security or the Department of Justice get a feeling like they can't handle ourselves out here, we're fucked. Fucked with a capital U. The towns go away. They'll most likely do their best to exterminate the citizens if they can't keep them cooped up or penned down in some cell somewhere, which would be a fucking tragedy. Most of these folks are people who were born, built, or summoned different, and yeah, given their nature, some of them deserve a healthy amount of fear. So if the government decides containment or pacification isn't cutting it, a lot of people are gonna get hurt, normal folk and monster folk alike. Guys like me, humans with a foot in the dark, we're extra boned. We'll get it from both sides. Not to mention that if the word gets around that the sheriff's department got kicked off a crime scene and one of the deputies got wounded, without so much of a bird flip back in the direction of the shitbirds, well, some things or some bodies out of the great beyond might get a few ideas in their damn fool heads, and they might get to plotting. And before you know it, boom, open warfare in the streets with the supernatural, both known and unknown. Hell, it's happened before, back in World War II. While Germany was at war and demonstrating to the world that monsters could be human too. The city of Dresden got a little too sporty, and some of the supernatural residents realized that the German army were mostly busy elsewhere. They might be able to start exerting a little more control over the city. That blew up fast, and it took extreme measures to get the city back under control. If we drop the ball and something like that happens on American soil, they'll definitely cause us to lose confidence with the powers that be. They'll probably cut our funding. Life's a fickle bitch as it is, and in this fucking town, that goes double.
All right,
Senior Deputy Gruck finally said, after checking her weapons and gear, feeling she was about ready as she was going to ever be.
Are you ready, kids?
Dollywall smiled over at her. He looked over at me and gave me a rakish feline grin, showing a lot of fang. Yeah, he was ready. I had a strange feeling. I mean, besides the discomfort one might feel before attempting to communicate with the feral unknown, which may or may not lead to a knockdown slobber knocker of a fight to the death, of which the outcome could not be certain. Maybe it was something in the air. Anticipation, maybe. Like the world knew something was about to go down. Or the elements themselves were watching, which they do from time to time. Side note. The elements have avatars, and they send them forth to do their bidding, and occasionally to get eyes on something they wanted a closer look at. Or sometimes just to handle the more mundane affairs of the wild. You run across them from time to time. I once pulled over the avatar of the wind. His voice sounded like the wind wailing past your house in the dead of night. He radiated relaxed power, yet at the same time was the definition of bland nondescription. He was respectful, but his eyes had an annoyed cast to them, as if bowing to the authority of a lowly sheriff's deputy in a traffic stop was many stations beneath him, which, to be fair, a case could be made for that notion. He was driving a Baradol L-Series Mack truck with shiny chrome aftermarket exhaust stacks which gleamed brightly in the moonlight. They looked really out of place on that beaten old down workhorse of a truck. He was hauling a livestock trailer full of wild hogs up to Dallas. The trailer shook violently as they battered the walls trying to get free. No idea how that truck, or the trailer for that matter, was still roadworthy, nor what he was doing with said wild hogs. But his inspection was up to date. His logbook was in good shape, and his scale ticket showed him at well under 80,000 pounds. So I let him go and told him to drive safe. He bowed his head slightly, as if my drive safe was a divine blessing, and started throwing gears off into the night. Now, of course, we're a mere mortal, there would have been a bit more of a process, but sometimes it's just best to let sleeping dogs lie. His name was Pete, though, and I found that amusing. Pete driving a bike. But back to the story at hand. I felt something in the air, the feeling you get when something big is about to happen. I feel goosebumps rising on my flesh. I felt eyes watching me, from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Might have been real. Might have been my imagination. Might have just been shitbirds. Didn't matter at this point. I met Greg's eyes. Something unspoken passed between us, and she felt it too. We may or may not have had an audience. I made a show trying to stay cool despite every part of my lizard brain telling me to make a break for the cars and put this place in the rear view. I raised my pistol and did my press check. I had a 10mm round chambered and ready to go. "Let's get it, Mama Bear," I said, doing my best to channel Sam Elliott's version of gunfighter cool. Greg nodded at me. A brief smile played over her lips. The look on her face was that of a mama who was particularly proud of one of her kids. I briefly wondered if that was her way of somehow saying goodbye. Kind of like she was saying, "We might die in the next few minutes, but I want you to remember me with a smile." She shifted her gaze back up to the Valkyrie. Her features quickly took a different set, that of a decidedly angry orc, which made sense because that's what she was.
You, bird!
She roared, channeling the mighty orc war chief she was born to be.
Where's your master?
As if on cue, the trees erupted with noise and fury, as if the mention of the master in a non-subjugant's mouth was an insult on a grand scale, one that should not be tolerated. Feathery bodies exploded out of the trees at the edges of the clearing, the shitbirds taken to wing in the night sky under a hellish and unseemly racket. It was a disturbing sight, and I damn near started popping off with a Glock right then and there. The dark made it look like they were melting out of the trees. We had been dead wrong in our estimate of their numbers earlier in the evening. It was a hell of a lot more than 20 or 30 of them. Watching the creatures ascend into the night sky was a terrifying sight indeed. They couldn't blot out the moon, but damn if they weren't going to try. "I think we may have just stepped in it," I muttered under my breath. "Sure, talk to the bird monster. See whose boss is. Have a few drinks. Now, what's the worst that could happen?" I was totally channeling John McClane crawling through an air duct at that moment. I noticed that the shitbirds seemed to have a sense of order in their chaos. While each individual seemed to fly a haphazard path, they all stuck to a general circle above us. It was almost like somebody had taken a tornado and filled it with feathers and dumped it ass over tea kettle right over our heads. The moon above them outlined them, making their features shadowy and slightly more intimidating. They put on a show for us. Two would seem to be hurtling right at each other, but pull off their path right at the last second, zipping off in a new direction, or dipping just out of the way without so much of a brush of the wings. Some pulled loop-de-loops. We saw one do a barrel roll. It truly was the most impressive show of aerial acrobatics. A few got brave and made as if they were going to dive bomb us, but would pull up just roughly 30 feet over our heads, playing fuck games with us, trying to get our fear up, I suppose. Not like they needed to, but sure, why not? The main shitbird, who seemed to be the voice box of the flock, glared down at us, fury burning in his white eyes. I realized that he seemed to be a little bigger than the others, and I idly wondered if he was the top dog of the flock. The big bird, so to speak.
You think this petty show of force is going to frighten us?
Grug barked at the talker.
You think that we, warriors of the mighty land of Texas, are intimidated by birds?
The last words were soaking in mock incredulous anger. She was laying on the theatrics, and she did when she was in orc warrior chief mode, and she was now. It was mostly for show, partly because it was the way these things were done, and a small bit of it was for plain old bravado. However, it wasn't doing my bravado a lick of damn good, though. I was still on the verge of making a mess of my jockey shorts. Dollywall seemed to be eating it up, though. He had his pistol clutched in one hand, and his free hand was flexed. His claws were out. He made swipes at the dive-bombing birds. Even though they weren't even close to being in swiping range, he was roaring along with Grook's words. I got the mental image of him swiping out a giant version of one of those cat toys. The ones with a brightly colored ball of fluff hanging from a string. Despite the situation, that gave me a laugh snort. Who's a good kitty?
Birds!
Grug spat at the herald.
Your coward of a master wouldn't dare put himself at our sight. For the fear of his spindly little neck, he sends birds, an insult to those amongst the mightiest warriors of 3 great peoples. Tell your master that his cowardice is known, boy.
That pissed them off. A shitbird got real ballsy and didn't pull out of its dive. He was barreling straight for Lavonda, his arms outstretched and his talons flexed. Looked like he was just gonna send it. His screaming put me into a mind of a dive bomber aimed straight at a tank. All fury with a powerful promise of a painfully violent death. Senior Deputy Gruck, however, was seriously unimpressed. In the last moment, she swung her stun baton in an overhead arc as hard as she could, making contact with the shoulder of the creature. Nikola Tesla picked that moment to enter the fray. He was wearing his shit kickers. A brilliant blue light exploded out of the end of the baton, on contact with the shitbird's outstretched shoulder. Needless to say, the bird didn't complete its dive bombing run. It let out a shriek of pain as it rode the lightning, every muscle in its wiry body tensing up at once and fire burning along its nerves. The baton crushing its shoulder sent it off course. The shitbird crashed into the dirt road next to Grook's feet. The sound it made on impact was similar to a bag of sticks being swung at a brick wall. The stink of burning feathers filled the air. I swear, somewhere off in the great beyond, I heard the ghost of Ben Franklin calling the monster a bitch. Bird bones are hollow and easily broken. So too are Valkyries. This one didn't come away from its introduction on the ground anywhere close to unscathed. Quite the opposite, in fact. The thing rolled on the dirt like a terrified spider whose legs were broken. It tried unsuccessfully to get away from the angry orc, but his body was just too broken to cooperate. Dark red arterial blood spilled from the compound fractures. Broken bones gruesomely pierced out of its feathery hide. The sounds coming out of the beak were ungodly. Shattered wings flailed about, as if the brain sent out commands, but its body was just too destroyed to cooperate. Grook brought her baton down on the creature's head. It collapsed inward like a rotten cantaloupe. The shitbird's flailing around suddenly stopped. Blood exploded from its beak, and its battered body went limp. Grook looked up at the master's herald. Her eyes met his. She cleared her throat and spat in the dirt, as if to say, "What else you got?" And with that, he decided to honor her unasked question. He would show us in fact what else he had. The entire flock as one went wild for a moment. Bird monsters darting around like moths around a lamp. A mournful wailing ripped the night apart. It was coming from above our heads. I all of a sudden got the feeling that shitbird Lavonda had ended might have been a popular guy. The sort of fella that the bird folk might want to avenge. Because all at once, they all dropped the aerobatic and started flying straight upward, flapping hard for as much altitude as they could muster. The talking bird joined them. The flock spread out until they were all roughly at the same altitude. Then, as one, they all started screaming, which was scary as shit in its own right, but once they had all had a good little shout, they dove for us.